Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to Shadows in the Night, presented this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on your time zone, by Felony and Mayhem Press in association with Baker Street West, a nonprofit in the Sierra foothills that is devoted to everything Sherlockian. So if Sherlock Holmes and his world are what makes your heart sing, please look them up online and you will find both your people and events and programs to gladden your heart. And who is Felony and Mayhem? Well, we like to say we publish the very best in intelligent mystery fiction. For today's program, we are delighted to welcome one of our favorite authors, direct from London, Miss Michelle Birkby. She is the author of the Baker Street Inquiries, both books of which we are delighted to publish, and she will be interviewed today by a lady whose name I suspect some of you may recognize, a certain Miss Irene Adler. There we go. Hello. And after the interview, we will open up the floor to questions. Please feel free to ask Michelle about her books and her fascination with historical crime fiction, about her research, about the world of Sherlock Holmes, about the ways in which the social changes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries created enormous changes in crime fiction, and produced just huge changes in the mystery novels we all love. But to begin with, we have a dramatic reading from No One Notices the Boys. That's the second of the Baker Street Inquiries. We thought about asking Michelle to set it up, but we looked at the video and we thought about you folks and we thought, you know, these are smart people. They will figure it out. So with no more ado, Mr. Music, please take it away. No One Notices the Boys by Michelle Birkby. The place is London, and the year is 1889. Mrs. Martha Hudson, housekeeper to Sherlock Holmes, is in hospital. She's accustomed to being busy, and she is not comfortable being stuck in a hospital bed all day.
Her visitor is Mary Watson, the wife of Dr. John Watson. She and Mrs. Hudson have known each other for a good while, and they have already investigated one case together.
They are best friends.
Hello, how are you? I've brought books. Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, and also a copy of the Times.
Oh, will you look at that front page? That's a bit bloodthirsty, isn't it?
Well, it's the state of the world. Can't blame the Times.
You're very funny. Well, at least I'll get a chance to read Frankenstein. I was never allowed to read it as a girl, you know. So, how is everyone?
Sherlock's come to stay with us while you're in hospital.
Oh, gosh.
It's wonderful. John picks his brain for stories all evening, and I cross-examine him like a lawyer about his cases. Cook goes around staring at him. She thinks he's the most thrilling man that ever lived. He blew up her best saucepan yesterday with one of his experiments, and she was delighted.
Yeah, he must be desperate to find a case to escape through.
He keeps coming to the hospital to do experiments. He's in here now, you know, just a few doors down in the laboratories.
Oh, no, he can't see me like this. Oh, no, I will not be helpless in front of Sherlock Holmes.
He doesn't do bedside manners and sympathy, so I think you're safe. Look at this page of the Times. There's something I want you to see.
Waterfall for sale. Yeah, well, that's very nice, Mary, but I don't think 221B Baker Street has room for a waterfall.
Not that. Below it.
Man seeks child around 7 backward for an educational experiment. Well, I don't like it, but oh, you have a case, don't you?
I heard about boys disappearing.
Yeah, well, it's London. That happens, unfortunately.
No, not street boys. At least they're not all street boys. And I'm not talking ran away. I mean stolen. Boys taken from workhouses by people pretending to be their mothers. Working boys who disappear from their jobs. Middle-class boys too, with homes taken from the front garden of the street, just gone. 1 minute there and then gone.
No, that would be in the news if it kept happening.
It doesn't happen all at once. That's the point. Just a few a year, no more than 2 or 3. And no one reports the missing workhouse boys or the apprentices. As for the others, the police investigate, find nothing, assume the boys will come back. It's not as if they're important. They aren't the sons of MPs or the sons of dukes. They're just ordinary boys and no one cares. It's been going on for years.
And no one's noticed.
The cases are scattered. If you look at them on a map, you'd see they come from all over the city, even outside London, and spread out all over a number of years. No one could see what was happening because people were looking too closely, instead of at the big picture, the really big picture, like looking at one corner of a tapestry and seeing only a few stitches, instead of standing back and seeing the entire pattern.
All right. So what is the entire pattern? What are your criteria, as Mr. Holmes would say?
Boys, no younger than 5, no older than 10, all gone in a moment, sometimes just as their mothers' backs were turned, no trace of them ever found.
And you think this man in the advertisement is taking him?
I don't know. Maybe, probably not. It's likely he's just some well-meaning eccentric with ideas about education he wants to try out. But the point is, someone will give him children. There are so many unwanted or abandoned children around. We only see a glimpse of what happens to them when it touches someone with money. Children just disappear and it isn't right. They're lost. London is full of lost children. It's time someone found them.
All right. So what makes you think they're in London?
Everyone comes to London. Anyone who's lost.
Oh, besides romantic mythology.
The majority of the disappearances are in and around London. And London has a large number of itinerant children and hiding places. And I have something else.
Yes, I can tell that. And I can tell you think I won't like it. So go on then. Tell me.
Have you heard the story of the Pale Boys?
That's a ghost story, isn't it? It's a story that the Baker Street irregulars tell each other. The Pale Boys, all in black. They only come out at night and they float above the ground and kill with a touch. It's a story of the streets. Come on, some more of that romantic mythology about London. Oh, it's just a tale, Mary. The children like to frighten each other with it.
But tales of horror can be based on actual fact. Like Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde. Both of those are based on science, aren't they? I mean, science pushed beyond limits and morality, but still based on actual fact. Like the Pale Boys.
All right. Once I'm out of here, we'll look into it, yes? You don't go charging off into anything yourself. I do not want you getting shot again.
Oh, John's already forgotten that happened.
Yeah.
So you don't mind investigating a ghost story?
Don't mind. I think I have one myself, perhaps. You remember talking to Emma last time you came?
The one who was a courtesan, with all the wonderful stories about all the famous men she'd been with.
Yeah, that's her.
One who was writing a book about it all.
Mm-hmm.
I saw her bed was empty. I thought she'd gone home. She hasn't gone home, has she?
No, she died. Not in her own bed. In that bed, in the corner there. She had to be moved because her bed got tea spilt over it. And she went into that empty bed. And then last night, oh, you know, Mary, I tell you off for mythologizing, but I saw something that I cannot explain, and it was something awful.
Tell me.
It's very odd. I was so drowsy, you know, and I slept really heavily, which is unusual. And everyone slept, and that is strange because Eleanor Langham, she normally sits up all night. And Miranda Logan, she normally wakes up at the slightest sound. But neither one of them moved. I did wake up, round 3, but I couldn't move. I could only watch. And I couldn't stop it, Mary.
What did you see?
Emma, in that bed, in the bed, at the end. And shadow. It was so dark, you know. I saw something, right? A shape, darker than the shadows, just a greater darkness against the lesser darkness. And it come out of the door at that end. It walked past the beds to Emma's bed. And it bent over her. And then whatever it was, it put a pillow over her face and it knelt on it. And she struggled. She fought back. And I tried to call out, but I couldn't move.
No one heard or saw a thing. Where were the nurses?
Oh, no idea. No one woke. Or if they did, they was frozen like me.
It sounds like you were all heavily drugged, more than usual, I mean. That can do odd things to the mind.
No, it wasn't the drugs. And it was not a dream.
You're sure?
Where Emma was gone this morning. And I saw that shadow before, first night. I saw that shadow come out, do the same thing, same bed. And in the morning, I thought I had imagined it because I was so ill at that time. I thought it was the spectre of death come for me. I know, it's foolish.
No, it's not foolish. Sometimes I imagine death is out there on the street, just an ordinary man or woman in a black coat, and they brush past us and we feel a chill against our shoulder, and it's death saying, you tomorrow, and you next week, and you by the end of the year.
Stop that. Stop that. There's too many ghost stories, Mary. Yeah. You have a scientific mind, use it. No matter what I may have imagined, cold fact is that twice I've seen a woman in that bed at the end, approached by a figure at night, when the nurses is out of the room, and twice that woman is dead in the morning.
You're rational, even when drugged, Martha. Even Mr. Holmes would say that. I agree you saw something. Isn't it typical? Even in hospital, you find a case to investigate.
You managed to find one without me.
We're blessed. Or cursed. Do you feel safe staying here? Would you rather leave?
I think as long as I'm not at that bed at the end, it would be all right. Besides, I need to investigate, and this is the best place, even if it does put me at risk. I have to know. You understand that, don't you?
John says it's the besetting sin of all detectives. The need to know, even at the cost of our own lives. Right, I understand. But if you are in trouble, send for me, or John, or Sherlock. We'll come running, understand?
Yeah. There's 2 cases, though. Murderers in the night and missing children and the ghosts and the shadows. We're not experienced at this kind of thing, Mary. Is it too much for us? Should we pass it on to Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson?
No bloody fear.
Yeah, I thought you'd say that. It's our cases, then. We are the detectives.
Our cases. To hell with Sherlock Holmes. This is for Mrs. Hudson and Mary Watson.
Folks, I am so sorry for the audio problems. As I said in chat, we will be sending out an email with discount codes and abject apologies and a link to the archived version. For those of you who are still with us, I hope you can hear because we are now about to have an interview with Michelle Birkby. Michelle, you want to unmute yourself? And Miss Irene Adler. Why don't you unmute yourself?
I think I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Yep. Oh, lovely. Good afternoon or morning. Here it's morning, but I think it's quite late in the day for you, dear Michelle. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, and it's lovely to see you too.
I just so excited to know that you're actually penning adventures that feature my good friend Martha and Mary Watson. And you know that I have a little part in that. So I'm so glad that you got us all right. So thank you so much for that. But I think our lovely viewers today would like to know what brought you to Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes, it started when I was a child, and the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies were on television. And of course, Basil Rathbone is a very attractive man. And I just watched all of them, and I became obsessed with Sherlock Holmes. And then I got a book of the Sherlock Holmes short stories for Christmas, a whole big, thick book, wonderful book. And about the same time, Jeremy Brett started doing the Granada series of Sherlock Holmes and put all that together. And I just became obsessed. These wonderful, brilliant stories in this entirely different world with these fascinating characters.
That, you know, I think we all discover Mr. Holmes in a different direction, but I think yours is quite an adventure. I do want to know what sparked your interest in developing the stories about Martha Hudson and Mary Watson.
Well, I was reading the stories again. I think this must have been about the 30th time I'd read them. There's a story called The Final Problem. No, actually, I mean The Empty House. And in that, well, I don't want to spoil it, but in that, Mrs. Hudson ends up crawling around the floor of 221B Baker Street in her crinoline and dress and everything, moving the wax head of Sherlock Holmes in the window without being seen by the big game hunter that is across the street. And I'm reading this, as I usually do, and suddenly a thought pops into my head. I'm sure this isn't covered by the rent. And I just thought, this is a really unusual housekeeper. And there's one line in The Man with the Hare Lip where Dr. Watson talks about how people always run into Mary Watson for help. And I just thought, there's stories here, stories we've never heard that have produced these two remarkable women. And I just wanted to write those stories, the ones we didn't know about, but were obviously happening behind the scenes.
Well, you found two very strong Victorian women, and I think Victorian women needed to be strong, although the Victorian men did everything they could to convince others otherwise. So when you were doing your research, particularly for Victorian women, what were some of the obstacles or concerns that you had when you were looking at the times for Victorian women?
The problem is that most of the accounts are written by men, and usually rich, older men, the MPs, the lawyers, the people like that. So it was difficult to get their voice. There are some female writers, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, for example, Charlotte Bronte and so on, that gave a voice to women. But I found interesting was the court cases, because they were recorded verbatim. So I would go through the recordings of the court cases and listen to what the women in those courts were saying and doing. And it was just fascinating because there was men on one side saying women, the weaker sex, can't do anything. There are women on the other side who are running businesses, looking after entire families, murdering their husbands, and doing all kinds of amazing things. And we had never heard their voice because their voice is always silent. Even in the true crime books written about them, you don't get to hear their voice, but you go back to the source material and it's all there. And it's fascinating to hear them speak years later. And there's some diaries being published now as well.
So as we get into the early 20th century, coming out of World War I, we do start to see female mystery writers not only being published, but becoming incredibly popular, right?
Yes.
Agatha Christie, obviously. Can you name any others for us?
Naya Marsh, obviously, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers. They're all roughly around the same time. They all have quite different backgrounds, actually, but they do all create a detective. And the detective they normally create, the first detectives they create are men: Peter Wimsey, Inspector Allen, even Poirot, although he's a refugee and he's a little short, fat Belgian refugee, totally different from every detective who's gone before. As time goes on, these female crime writers start to write about women. I mean, you've got Inspector Allen, but Agatha Troy comes in and becomes the more interesting character. You've got Agatha Christie switching to Miss Marple, who is my favourite Christie detective. And she always has a lot of strong women in it. You've got Dorothy L. Sayers, who's been writing Whimsy as this idiot. And then in comes Harriet Vane. And not only is Harriet Vane more interesting, but she makes Peter Wimsey more interesting, even in the books where she's not actually in. And so they start to bring out a woman's voice, not only in what they're writing, but the women in their novels themselves get to speak and investigate.
I think it's wonderful that way that you worked with some of the aspects of Victorian women and the fact that they could be invisible. So Martha Hudson and Mary Watson and myself could make our inquiries without being noticed. We could become invisible. And I think that was to their advantage in your stories. As you were writing, which character did you connect with the most?
I think that's difficult because when I started writing, it was certainly Martha. Martha in the way that is always in the background. She's always not quite paid attention to. And they're all sort of, she's not really important to people sort of outside her world, or people think she's not important. But the more I've written it, the more I've become to identify with Mary in many ways. Mary has this love and excitement and fascination for science. And I've also got this love and excitement and fascination for new scientific discoveries. So I'm sort of torn between Martha discovering how strong she is and stepping out of the background, and Mary just go, oh, wow, new scientific discoveries every week. So I think I've put a bit of myself in both of them, and I sort of identify with both of them when I write. Although I've given them two very different voices. Sort of Mary's often what I wish I would say, and Martha's what I would actually say in many situations.
What was the hardest part of No One Noticed the Boys for you to write?
Putting Martha in hospital, because I started writing it while I was in hospital, and I didn't like that at all. I found it very difficult. And then to put Martha, who is a character I care for deeply, also in pain, also in the same situation. It was like, oh, I really don't want to do this to her, but I must. And that I found it very difficult. I was sort of like sitting there going, oh, no, she's in pain. This is horrible. I don't want her to have to go through this. But if she's going to do the case, then she has to go through it. That was the most difficult for me, I think, because I identified so strongly with Martha.
When you were writing about the hospital and the whole scenario there, it was very vivid. So what did you use as your research?
St. Bartholomew's Hospital Museum. It's a tiny little museum, absolutely perfect. Tiny little jewel of a museum with so much information crammed into it. And when I went to visit St. Bartholomew's Hospital, they'd just finished filming Sherlock there, and people had graffiti, Sherlock lives, all over the hospital. It was wonderful. It was like this little sign for me as I went in. So I went in there and I researched that. And there's some Florence Nightingale reports about hospitals. Florence Nightingale was a great architect for hospitals. So I visited the Florence Nightingale Museum and looked at what she wrote about hospitals and how hospitals could be better, and what she thought were good hospitals, what she thought were bad hospitals. There's these two tiny but perfect museums, and I got a lot of information from those.
Well, thank you for painting such a vivid picture. It made it very real. What I asked you, what was the most difficult part to write? So what was the most fun to write? I mean, No One Noticed the Boys.
Oh, that's difficult, because I quite enjoy quite a lot of it. I do enjoy the descriptions at the end where they face where they face who the killer is, and they sort of have their moment. I liked the bit with the reporter going to that reporter's house, the open-line reporter, and finding Lillian there and discovering all these old facts, walking down Fleet Street while the publishers are sort of banging underneath, printing out the day's newspapers, and going to that
Where the
reporter's
newspapers were printed.
yeah. So you had the newspaper, Fleet Street was shake with the sound of the printers, and all the streets and alleyways around Fleet Street are named after papers. And going to his house and just, because I did a research walking down Fleet Street, and it was just such a fascinating place to be, but being in his place and just this man with this interesting mind, and seeing Martha sort of battling in a way with this man and all the things he knew. I just really enjoyed that part, really enjoyed envisioning how Fleet Street was in those days. I really enjoyed that part.
Do you think any of it is still there? If you sort of look around the corner, if you squint, do you think you can still see bits of it?
Yes, you can. I mean, the little courtyards are still there. They're all clean now and quiet. But if you can imagine how filthy and noisy Fleet Street would be, you look at it, look, the printers aren't there anymore. But you can go and see the buildings, and if you just use a little bit of imagination, you can see how it would have been once. I really do actually like Fleet Street. It's a great place to go.
When you were doing your research, what surprised you? Were there any things you uncovered that really surprised you?
I think when I went into, I mean, it wasn't researching for this particular novel, but just researching Victoriana in general, is they had this cult of the child. There's what child's a precious little being. In theory, in practice, children had terrible lives, sent up chimneys, abandoned in workhouses, abandoned at foundling homes, sent out to work at 5, 6 years old. And it was just this dichotomy between what Victorians said about children and what Victorians actually did for children. Even rich children, they got sent away at 7 to boarding school. They had these awful duties imposed on them, and boarding schools were not sort of nice places to be either. It's just the way they treated children did not match up with the way they talked about children, and it actually made me quite furious reading about the way children were treated in Victorian times and what people had to do to get children looked after, and reading about baby farmers and the family hospital and so on. And I got quite angry, and because I got so angry reading about it, I thought, well, that has to go in the next book then.
That's fascinating.
It tends to be things that make me angry that I want to write about in these books.
Well, thank you for bringing things to the spotlight so we can see and actually learn, not only be a part of the adventure, but also to be illuminated with what was actually taking place. If you could meet your characters now, what would you say to them?
If I met Mary, I would sit down and I would want to talk to her about the latest forensic investigations, like the Marsh test, which is the first reliable test for arsenic, and it was used in courts, and it was part of quite a few really important cases. I would love to sit down and discuss that with her.
When was that developed?
Oh, about the 1840s, something like that. You've got the Roche test and the Marsh test, and you've got about the 1840s, 1850s. These are being developed and being used, and there's a particular coroner who uses it very well, whose name I cannot remember right now, but if it comes back to me, I will tell you. Swain Taylor.
This was the first.
Taylor.
This was the first time you could reliably say this person has been poisoned by arsenic.
Yes, and he actually expanded on loads of poisons. He wrote a brilliant book, which almost every murderer in every Christie or Niall Marsh book actually owns. Swain Taylor on poisons. In fact, there's one Niall Marsh mystery which is solved by the killer actually leaving the book open on the relevant page, which seems a bit stupid to me, but there you go. And Irene, I would like to know where she learned to do the things she does, because not all opera singers from New Jersey learn to disguise themselves as a boy and walk around Victorian London. There's things she knows that opera singers are not taught, and I would like to know where she learnt them. And as for Martha, I'm quite intimidated by Martha in some ways because she's such a strong woman. But I would like to sit down and talk to her about what is it actually like living with Sherlock Holmes, and what do you know that Sherlock Holmes doesn't? Because I know she's learned a lot of detection from Sherlock Holmes, but it goes both ways. he learns things from her too. And I would like to know what she has taught him about being a detective and about being a person and about fitting in this world. I would just like to know how they interact.
What do you think Martha Hudson and Mary Watson bring to the investigation of crime that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson don't bring to the table?
People. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is very into the clues, and Dr. Watson is just sort of standing there, sort of watching, going, yes, that's very interesting. He talks to people occasionally. He does get to know them. He flirts with the women, has a sporting chat with the men. But what Martha and Mary do is they get in there. They get into these places and they get to know these people. And there's quite a psychological approach to them. And Mary's fascinated by the science, but there's still this fascination with people, how they think, how they feel. And also they have a unique viewpoint that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson don't have, in that they're part of the women's world. Sherlock Holmes is, despite everything he says about women, actually quite supportive of them. He doesn't actually say it, but he does it. But they know what it's like to be a housekeeper. They know what it's like to be a woman in this world that's so dominated by men. And they know what it's like to be not the people at the top of society. They know what it's like to be not in charge or told they're not in charge. I think that's where they bring a unique insight, a unique viewpoint, and people. They want to know people. They like people.
That actually leads really nicely into one of the questions we've got in chat. Michael asks, I'd like if Miss Birkby would talk about the difficulty of plotting women characters around the limitations placed on middle and upper class women in public life.
Oh, yes, it's quite difficult because I can't send them running after the taxi with a gun in their hands. I can. But, there's things they can't do. They can't go striding into a man's home the way Sherlock Holmes does. They can't sort of charge into a place and demand information. They can't walk into the police station and say, I'm a rich man, please tell me everything I wish to know. So they have to be more insidious in a way. They have to find another way in. Often the other way in is through the other women, sort of like it'll be through wives, nurses, that's those sort of people. They have to slip in through the background, through the sidelines, and sort of coax the information out. I mean, they do sort of turn to crime at certain points because sometimes crime is the only thing that works, but they can't be as upfront as Sherlock, and they can't demand things the way Sherlock does. So they have to coax, and they have to ask, and they have to play little tricks and play little games and sort of stand in the background listening and so on. So yes, it is, they can't behave the same way Holmes and Watson do. They have to find a different but equally effective way of behaving, of getting their information.
We have another question that is not related at all, but fascinating. David wants to know whether Sweeney Todd was a real character.
He was not, unfortunately.
My heart.
There's a book called The String of Pearls, which is which is the first creation of Sweeney Todd, and this is 1600s, late 1600s, I believe. String of Pearls. It's a good book, actually. Very well done, and it's just one of those stories like Spring-Heeled Jack that just caught the imagination because it evoked London so well, and people thought, well, if there's going to be a demon barber, it might as well be in Fleet Street. So you did have this wonderful story, and it was like Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde. It just really caught people's imagination, and people thought it must be real. Fortunately, he's not, but that does not mean that London does not have its fair share of really strange and bizarre murders.
Tell, come on. What?
Let's look at, there's the Ratcliffe Highway murders, which is about the same time as String of Pearls, roughly, which is about, there's this house, a draper shop on the Ratcliffe Highway. And at midnight, they send the servant girl out to buy some oysters because the shop's shut at midnight and you can still buy oysters at midnight. Servant girl goes out, tries to buy oysters. I don't think she finds any. She comes back at midnight, can't get into the house, knocks on all the doors. I believe it's the watchman who comes and breaks in and finds everybody in the house murdered. Their throat cut, even the baby. Blood everywhere. And no killer in sight. And that is just the first set of murders. I highly recommend reading up on the Ratcliffe Highway murders. It's one of the most gruesome Ratcliffe Highway murders.
And these were real.
Yes, this is a real murder, and that's not the last murders. And
was it ever solved? Did they ever figure out who did it?
Allegedly. However, P.D. James wrote a book, which I believe is called The Pear and the Mole Tree, in which he questioned the identity of the man they charged with it.
It's Mole and the Pear Tree. Yes.
Pear and the Mole, yeah, something like that.
Mole and the Pear Tree. Mm-hmm.
Mole and the Pear Tree, yes. But yeah, that's just one of the fascinating murders in London. It's one of the most gruesome.
Elizabeth wants to know, so Sherlock Holmes, we know those stories were very popular. Were mystery stories in general popular during this period?
Yes, absolutely. You've got Wilkie Collins churning out masses of really, really good detective stories. Charles Dickens, of course, he writes detective stories. And Charles Dickens actually got himself, what modern phrase would be, embedded with the police. And he actually worked with the police. And some of the characters, the policeman character in Bleak House was actually based on the real policeman he knew, as is the same policeman also inspired Inspector Cuff in The Moonstone. So you do have loads of detective stories. You also have the sort of the yellow-backed novels, the sort of cheap paper novels that would like fall apart in 6 months or something. They were incredibly popular. That were detective stories, and there were actually 2 series about female detectives who work with the police, which are actually very good. They've been lost for a while, but they've come back. You've got Carnacki, who hunts ghosts. You've got Thorndyke, who is the blind detective. You've got a lot of detectives. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is absolutely the best, but the detective story is very popular. But the detectives are all sort of fairly well off, middle class men who are quite imperious. I mean, apart from the 2 female characters. And so they all sort of fit a standard stereotype.
Do you have any sense of why mystery stories were so popular in the 19th century and coming into the 20th?
They were just good to read. You've got the rise of the printing press. And the printing press, print is now cheap. Anyone can buy a newspaper. Anyone can buy Mrs. Beeton's Annual, which is where the first Sherlock Holmes stories is published. Anyone can buy a copy of The Strand. And travel. People are traveling on trains. People want something to read on the trains. People go to the W.H. Smith's bookshop and buy a magazine. So you've got loads of people wanting something to distract them from 3 hours of train travel down to Cornwall. So you've got lots of that. You've got the rise of reading. So you've got loads of working class schools set up so that working children, working men, and hopefully working women can learn to read. They need something to read. They want something exciting. So they read detective novels. There's also a rise in supernatural novels at this time. So people want an exciting story to take their mind off their lives and to pass the time.
You know, I think we are getting ready to wind this up. Irene, do you have any more questions for Michelle?
Well, I was wondering if Michelle had plans for something in another adventure in the future and what direction it might take. Is there going to be more of a relationship between Mrs. Hudson and Mr. Holmes? Or are you going off on another adventure? I know there's lots of female criminals, and perhaps maybe that might be a direction that you would go.
I think you might have read my mind.
Ah!
Yes, I mean, I'm continuing to write the stories. I'm continuing to, I don't want to say too much. I'm continuing to look at the canon for interesting characters to add and to weave. I like to weave my stories around the Sherlock Holmes canon. And yes, I think I do have some interesting characters in mind for the future and hopefully some interesting plots that I am working on.
And Stephanie wants to know whether you think of your work as having some kind of message or moral. In other words, are you trying to say something about women of the era, or is that merely background for the fun story? Or both?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's like if you look at somebody like Charles Dickens' stories, they're a very good read, but there's also a message in there. And I think my message is don't underestimate the women. Whatever you do. But there's also a lot to be said about the Victorian era, that the Victorian era can be looked back at with rose-colored glasses. You'll see period dramas where everybody's wearing a big skirt and flirting with a fan and everything. But there's a lot about Victorian times that is dark and depressing and needs to be brought out into the light. And there's a lot in Victorian times that reflects things that we go through now. So I do want to bring that out into the light. I want people to look at Victorian times and go, well, I didn't know that, but now I do. Especially when it comes to people who are overlooked, women, the poor, all kinds of groups that weren't represented at all, and they should have been. But I do also hope that it's a good read, an enjoyable read. And I hope people find them exciting.
Yes, I think I can promise that people will. Margaret says she's often disappointed in period fiction when women who have limited education are also presented as having limited brains. And is this something that you feel the need to address in your books?
Well, the thing with Martha and Mary is that they're both quite well educated. Mary came to school in England and has become a governess, and Martha's got her education. She had a good education. But yes, I'm trying to sort of look at women who haven't had the advantages they have, and I'm consciously trying in future books to have women who haven't had the advantages they have, but are still clever and are still cunning and thoughtful and know things perhaps that you can't learn in any school. So yes, there's this
I'm thinking about Wiggins and the Irregulars. I mean, they don't have good educations. They pretty much don't have any education. But,
yeah,
but they're smart wits.
Yeah, they're clever. They've learned on the streets and so on. But yes, Wiggins is very clever. Wiggins picks up any education that he can anywhere, and he uses it. So yes, I mean, there is a certain thing that, and women's education is not brilliant anyway, even if they do get educated. Mary's got quite a good one because she was trained to be a governess. But women's education, if you read Jane Eyre, it's a little bit of geography, a little bit of French, a little bit of art, a little bit of music. So there's this whole, especially with Mary. Yeah, and with Mary, who loves science and wants more science. There's this hunger to learn science that has never really been satiated because Mary's never had that. But I've sort of tried to bring out that Mary learns and teaches herself and uses Sherlock to get an education in science.
And her husband too.
Oh, well, yes, she. Yes, I suppose she could learn something from John.
So I think we have one last question, which is going to feed into a question of mine. When were the Sherlock Holmes stories first introduced to the US? Do you know?
Oh, quite quickly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that Arthur Conan Doyle was very popular over here. I do know that, I don't know the exact date, but I do know you didn't have to wait very long because this was the time when books, papers and so on just crossed over in the ships. I mean, I remember reading about people lining up on the quay to get the next edition of the O Curiosity Shop to find out little Ned.
Well, you're right. The famous people yelling before the ship is even docked, while the ship is still coming into harbor, yelling across with microphones, "Is little Nell still alive?"
Yes, exactly. So I don't think it took very long. I do know Arthur Conan Doyle was quite annoyed about bad copyright rules in America. so it must have been published over here. And of course, the second book is partially set. The first book, Studying Scarlet, has part of its story set in America. And quite a lot of the stories have either Americans in or they're set in America. And I do know Arthur Conan Doyle did like America, despite the copyright rules. So they must have come over here quite soon, I should imagine. Even if they weren't printed over here, I should imagine people in London picked up a copy of The Strand or Mrs. Beeton's Annual and took it back home with them. So I think they were probably published illegally when they were first published in America. But yes, I think they got here quite quickly.
So I think, do we have one more question? If anybody wants to ask something, now is the time. I'm looking at chat. I think that's all we have time for. There we go. Please, if you are feeling interested in the Baker Street inquiries, we encourage you to go to felonyandmayhem.com, use the code Baker Street for a very appealing discount. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, despite the technical glitches for which we are so apologetic, if you enjoyed the presentation, please think about signing up for our newsletter. We promise we will not flood your inbox, but we will keep you up to date on upcoming events. We plan our next one sometime within the next 6 to 8 weeks. What else do I want to say? Please remember to look into Baker Street West. And it remains only for me to say thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend next week for those of you in the US. So it remains just to say goodbye, good sleuthing, and the game is afoot.